Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the first Conservation Finance Learning Lab, Carbon Markets, Past, Present, and Future. This five-part series is meant to cover timely topics with accessible, actionable information and insight for practitioners, including topics coming later in the year, or I should say in early 2023, including public funding, the use of debt and other finance, corporate partnerships, and a dolphin tank project workshop. We're really glad you're joining us today. We hope we'll see you back for the rest of the series for whatever is most relevant to your work. I'm Lee Welpton. I'm Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Network. Our fundamental business is to expand people's capacity, confidence, and connections to execute on conservation finance. And we really work to bridge sectors and silos to help people find the capital resources they need to advance the pace and scale of their efforts. I'll share a word of thanks with my colleague Jackson Moeller, CFN's Chief Instigator and Project Coach, and our other teammate, Julia Mettler-Grove, our Project and Operations Maven. Also want to thank our many partners, colleagues, and friends who are joining us today, which also means a very generous thank you to Jackie, Jody, Tara, who can't be here today, and the Heisted team writ large, which is one of our closest partners, not only on this webinar series, but also on our website partnership with the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. We look forward to delivering an impactful series together. We're open to feedback and input from any and all. So please let us know, and thanks everyone. Lastly, in a kind of selfish CFN corner, I'll just share that CFN is currently hiring 2 new positions if you're interested in joining the team, a Forest Finance Associate and a Conservation Finance Fellow, an 11-month fellowship ideal for a recent grad. We're also gearing up for the 17th year of the Conservation Finance Bootcamp, which will return to the Yale School of Environment this year from June 5th to 9th. Applications will open January 10th. If you're interested, and many ways to get those updates from us. So now I'm going to hand things over to Jackie from Heisted's end.
Thank you for the introduction, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Wrigley, and I'm a Conservation Associate with Heisted. I'm so pleased to be with you today, and I'm really excited to hear from our panelists. I want to share just a bit about Heisted with you. We are a private operating foundation based in Connecticut and working all around New England and beyond with our partners. We envision a healthier, more livable world for all by working with our partners to conserve the land that sustains us and to steward our natural spaces, resources, and communities thoughtfully and inclusively. I'd also like to thank some people who have been working behind the scenes to bring us together today. I want to thank the entire Heisted team for their guidance and partnership, our moderator, Spencer Meyer, and the panelists, as well as the CFN team for their continued support and collaboration. And my final thank you goes to my co-host, Lee Welpton. Lee and her team have been great partners as they lead so many conservation finance programs and opportunities for all of us. And now I'd like to hand it back to Lee for some housekeeping.
Yes, so most folks know the drill by now for Zoom webinars. Please use the chat function for all questions. We'll be filtering those through and getting them fed to the panel during the discussion and Q&A. As you probably know, this session is being recorded for future distribution, which also means that if you have colleagues or partners who couldn't be here today, if you found this session useful and want to return back to it, we will have a recording up on the website in the coming weeks. And then you're going to get to meet our speakers, but if you want to dig deeper into their backgrounds and bios, those are available on the website, and we can share a direct link in the chat. So on to the show. Today, we're incredibly lucky to have 4 carbon experts to touch carbon markets from various perspectives, a pretty diverse lineup of how each person comes to the field. We hope the content in the discussion provides a heck of a lot of useful insight to you and your organization's exploration or consideration of carbon. And with that said, I'm going to delay no further and pass things over to you, Spencer. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you today. I was supposed to share a screen with everyone's picture, and I flubbed the technical bit there. So my apologies to all the those of you that didn't flub it. That's on me. So sorry about that. Yes, hi, my name is Spencer Meyer. I'm the head of science at NCX, or the Natural Capital Exchange. But I'm here today as really a friend of the Conservation Finance Network and a longtime member of CFN and the whole program. And it's really fun to be here working and seeing with all of you today. Before I joined NCX, I also led the Conservation Finance program at Highstead, our co-host for today. So just being here together with CFN and Highstead and many members of the ongoing CFN network, it's a really fun position for me to be in. And, looking through the list of registrants for the webinar today, I saw a lot of familiar names and former colleagues, but even more exciting, lots of new folks. And the interest in the carbon markets has never been stronger. And I know the community of people that have been working on this for a long time in the conservation and carbon worlds are really excited by all this interest. And CFN's been a really supportive community of people, always bringing new ideas to its membership, bringing us together and these learning opportunities, whether it's the conservation finance boot camps I hope many of you have participated in, to the ongoing series of in-person roundtables and the blogs and the web platform. And then, of course, these newer learning labs. It's just been a really fun environment. I've met a lot of wonderful colleagues, many of you through CFN, and learned a ton that's helped inspire my own work where I've been. So I want to thank the CFN team and the Highstead team and all of our friends and colleagues at Yale Center for Business and the Environment as well, and all of you network members that are here attending today. So in our webinar, we're going to discuss the carbon markets past, present, and future, hopefully with a lot of emphasis on the present and the future, because those are the opportunities we're all here to learn from. And CFN has a long history of bringing case studies and stories from the carbon markets to its network members. And this is another one in a long series and part of an ongoing conversation. As I said, the interest from landowners and conservation groups has never really been stronger than it is today. And so this is a really great opportunity to have this great panel of experts and practitioners to share their firsthand experience, both on the project development side and sort of the innovation side and actually implementing on the ground forest carbon projects. First, we have Steph Harris, the director of the carbon markets at 3 Degrees. We have Matt Marcotte, the executive director of the Loon Echo Land Trust, and one of my former partners in the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative that CFN has also highlighted in the past. And Jill Dazinski, the director of climate finance at the American Forest Foundation. So the program for today is, first, Steph is going to give us an overview of the carbon markets to make sure we do some level setting, everyone's on the same page, and those that are new to carbon markets will get up to speed quickly. And then the presentations we'll have from Matt and Jill will be a lot more impactful once we're all on the same page. And then Steph will come back again and talk more about her work at 3 Degrees and their work in the carbon markets. We have built in plenty of time for questions and answer today. I'll come back and join you for that and field questions from the audience, many of which are coming into the chat already. And I just want to take a brief moment to introduce NCX. We're a project developer and exchange for nature-based climate solutions, and we connect landowners of all sizes with corporate climate pioneers. Excuse me. In our first year and a half of running harvest deferral projects, we've been working with about 4,000 landowners in 39 states in the US, and we've enrolled about 4.5 million acres of forest land in the US in our carbon projects. We have several thousand more landowners who have signed up on our platform and are interested in creating carbon projects, many of whom might be with us today on the webinar, and we're all excited to learn more about these opportunities for small, medium, and large landowners alike. We're also at NCX working a lot on research and development on nature positive and biodiversity and other forms of natural capital credits as well. So I'm really excited to learn from our speakers today. And I just want to give you a few of the things I'm listening for as I hear the speakers today that hopefully we'll revisit in the Q&A session later on this afternoon. First, I'm really excited to hear how the carbon markets that we're going to hear about have built on the rich history of forest conservation principles that many of you folks representing land trusts and other NGOs have been really part of for a long time. There's a lot of exciting developments where smaller landowners now have access to the carbon markets where that was not always true. In the early days of CFN writing about the carbon markets, there were not a lot of opportunities for small landowners. but there certainly are now, and I know we're going to hear more about that. I'm also listening to hear how some of the evolving standards and different certification bodies and ratings agencies are layering into this debate, and listening for how some of the project developers and project leaders are thinking about that and where innovation is coming from. And I want to understand more about who are the ideal candidates for each of the carbon programs. I think we'll hear some differences in what the offerings are, what the carbon programs, how they can work with different types of landowners. And I think it'll be important for the audience to understand who slots in where and which programs are the best fit for everyone. Also, some interesting developments is that a couple federal agencies have been taking a real interest in the voluntary carbon market in particular, like the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Future Trading Corporation have been taking an interest in disclosures and reporting around the carbon markets. And so I think we're going to hear some more about how that's impacting different project opportunities. And then also this idea of nature positive. I was just at COP in Egypt, climate change conference a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk about nature positive and biodiversity crediting and how that intersects with the carbon market. And so I'm eager to hear from our speakers today how they're thinking about that, if they are at this point, or if that's really something down the road. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Steph to come on the screen and share the overview of voluntary carbon, or all the carbon markets. Thanks, Steph.
Alrighty. Let's see if I can get tech to be on my side today. Can you all see my screen?
Looks great, Steph.
Okay, thanks, Spencer. Hi, everyone, and thanks to everyone who's joining today, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm Steph Harris, the director on the carbon markets team at 3 Degrees. I've been with 3 Degrees since 2015, and I oversee all of our purchasing and sales of carbon credits. So I'll go into what 3 Degrees does and who we are a little bit later in the session, but we're going to start off with the fun and potentially daunting task of trying to do an overview of the carbon markets, maybe specifically the focus on the voluntary carbon market, in about 15 minutes. So we're going to dive right in. And so here's a brief agenda. We're going to start with carbon credit basics. We're going to look at the market structure, the participants, some project types. We're going to go into a bit more detail on purchasing considerations for buyers. What do buyers care about when they actually come to market, and what are some strategies that they need to think through, and how does that impact projects? And then again, we'll come back to 3 Degrees and some example projects that we're working on. So we're going to truly go to the basics just so everyone is on the same page here. I'm going to define exactly what a carbon credit is. So a carbon credit represents 1 metric ton of a greenhouse gas that is either avoided, reduced, or removed in order to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. Carbon credits are measured in terms of CO2 equivalent. So credits can be created from different types of projects that reduce, avoid, or remove different greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide or methane or HFCs, SO6. And companies and utilities purchase carbon credits to offset scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 being direct on-site emissions, and scope 3 being all emissions in upstream and downstream value chains. I will note that carbon credits should always be used as part of a larger climate strategy that prioritizes internal emission reductions first, and then uses carbon credits to address unabated emissions that a company can't yet reduce. So many of the buyers that we work with use carbon credits as a tool for taking near-term climate action, often addressing parts of their supply chain that don't yet have viable emission reduction solutions. All of the projects that we work with are registered with an internationally recognized independent standards body. These standards bodies create rules and requirements for project eligibility and quality criteria. Each body has a high-level standard that applies to all projects. And then underneath that standard, there are approved methodologies that apply to specific projects and specific project types. So each project type must have an approved methodology with one of these standards bodies in order to be able to create credits under that framework. For example, In order to register, let's say, a reforestation project with Verra, that project would need to meet the requirements of Verra's standard, which is called the Verified Carbon Standard, as well as Verra's specific reforestation methodology. The 4 standards on the left are voluntary standards, and the others on the right create standards for historic or even existing compliance markets. All of these entities also act as registries or electronic tracking systems where credits can be issued, transferred, or retired. And many of the voluntary standards are also not-for-profit organizations. And this slide gives an overview of the different steps and different groups involved in registering carbon projects and what it takes to manage those projects over time to actually create carbon credits. This is a very simplified version, let me say, but hopefully paints the picture of what's involved. So first, a project must be registered with the appropriate standards body listed on the last slide. This validation is a forward-looking activity where the project developer says, here's the activity we intend to do. Here's how we plan to set our baseline. Here's how we plan to collect data over time. Here's how we anticipate calculating our emission reductions or removals from that baseline. The developer is also required to show how the project is additional. We'll get into additionality in a few slides, and how it also meets the other requirements of the standard and the methodology. All of those documents are packaged up and verified by a third-party auditor and ultimately approved by the standards body. Once a project has been registered and validated, the project developer supports ongoing project verification, which retroactively assesses the emission reductions or removals from the project by saying, here's the activity that we actually did, here's the data to support that, and here's the specific quantification and number of carbon credits that we think should be awarded to the project. That data is again verified by a third-party auditor before being approved by the registry. And once that's complete, the registry can issue credits, which are then available to be sold into the market. The project will usually wait some time for more reduction or removal activity to occur and then undergo another verification and credit issuance. And carbon credits can be created from many different types of projects. There's a lot of icons on this graph, but this matrix is intended to show that you can typically evaluate projects on 2 axes. You have projects that avoid greenhouse gases, so think capturing methane at landfills and dairy farms, versus projects that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then on the other axis, we have nature-based projects, think forests and wetlands, versus technology-based solutions. Historically, the market has been made up of many more reduction or avoidance projects, which are represented by the icons in green, than removals projects, which is represented by the icons in blue. Recently, there's also been an increased focus on nature-based solutions or nature-based projects in particular. Given the increased emphasis on removing carbon from the atmosphere, as was really described in the 2018 IPCC report, we're assuming that the market is eventually going to be shifting over time towards longer-term removal solutions. So, think eventually towards the bottom right of this graph, but definitely a role for nature-based solutions to play in climate solutions over the next couple of decades. And then I want to point out that there is an overlap between the two. So represented by the icons in yellow, there are projects that both avoid emissions and also sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So improved forest management projects, for example, implement sustainable management plans at working forests, which delays timber harvesting, so that actually avoids emissions, but allowing those trees to grow longer allows them to sequester more carbon than what would have occurred under a more traditional harvesting schedule. So this project is often viewed as a type of project that both avoids emissions and removes carbon from the atmosphere. And we've recently seen the American Carbon Registry roll out a mechanism for actually tagging their removals credits separately from what the market is calling, or some folks in the market are calling, conservation credits. And on this slide, I just want to highlight that forestry and land use projects. My PowerPoint seems to have crashed. Bear with me for a second. All right. Can you all see that now?
Yep.
Okay, let me try to get to. Alrighty. Okay. So on this slide, I want to highlight that forestry and land use projects make up the largest category of credits, or made up the largest category of credits in 2021 of transactions, according to Ecosystem Marketplace. Ecosystem Marketplace is a reputable data provider in the voluntary market. They collect, aggregate, and anonymize transaction-specific data across the voluntary market. So not all market participants submit their data to EM, so this isn't completely inclusive of the entire market and all transactions, but it's a good proxy for general market activity and trends. You also might notice that the average price in this category is $580. That might seem pretty low to you, and that is correct. Remember, this is an average across all projects globally. So this would include some massive red projects, some of which can issue millions of credits per year. The average price point of US forestry projects is much higher than this right now. We've seen credits transact anywhere from the low teens up to the high 20s, depending on the specific attributes of the project. And I find this slide useful because it just shows a general overview of where credits are coming from, primarily from Asia and Latin America, and who the buyers are, which are primarily situated in North America and Europe. And I think this is relevant because we often have buyers inquire about projects that have some geographic relevance to their business and or their operations. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because in a minute or two, we're going to talk about some buyer preferences and purchasing considerations. And if we're just thinking about kind of traditional market structure, I think this group, Climate Tech VC, has done a good job outlining what do we think the traditional structure of the market look like. You have corporates that are setting targets. They have to conduct greenhouse gas audits, understand the scope of their emissions and their footprint, developing greenhouse gas reduction strategies, and then using offsets to address emissions that they can't reduce at that time. And then on the supply side, you have brokers that are aligning the supply and the demand. If I was creating this, I probably wouldn't put 3 degrees in the broker category, but I didn't. So you'll see an updated version on the next slide. But I've already mentioned you've got the registries and standards bodies. You've got project developers who are developing projects, asset owners. In this case, you can think of a landowner who might not be your project developer, but owns that land or the specific asset. And then independent quality enablers. So think third-party verification bodies that are accredited by the different standards bodies. And this is a maybe very busy slide. I believe all these slides will be shared, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But I think what I want to call out here is there's a lot of new market activity and new market participants that we've seen in this evolution of the market. So starting with the addition of maybe software providers that can help companies conduct their greenhouse gas audits and track their emissions over time. We're also seeing the rise of more what we'll call independent quality enablers. Spencer mentioned this at the top of the call, more rating agencies that are coming in and actually issuing ratings to specific projects, really similar to think like a bond credit rating. We're also seeing the rise of integrated marketplaces, groups that are acting as verification standards, as well as a platform for buyers and sellers. And we're seeing a massive rise in technology providers that are enabling the development of more sophisticated projects across all project categories. And I think I'm going to be pretty close on time. So I'm going to quickly go through some basic quality criteria that both projects and buyers need to consider. So additionality is one of the most important criteria for evaluating projects. It essentially means that a project would not have happened if it wasn't for the carbon market. And additionality can be assessed in a number of different ways. Regulatory additionality means that projects are not required by law. So a project owner should not get carbon revenue if they are required to implement that activity. Financial additionality means that projects would not be financially viable without carbon revenue. So if a project could fund this activity on their own, they would not be eligible for carbon revenue from a buyer. Accounting, greenhouse gas accounting, refers to how rigorous is the quantification of the verified reductions or removals. This involves setting a clear baseline, being able to calculate the reductions or removals from that baseline. This also involves clearly monitoring the project over time to be able to provide very clear evidence and data that the emission reductions have actually occurred. Permanence refers to the ability for the reductions or removals to be reversed, or how inherently permanent are the credits once that activity has taken place. Nature-based projects are subject to reversals, so not as permanent as technology-based projects, which are inherently more permanent. Finally, we often look at who the project participants are, who is benefiting from the sale of the carbon credits. And we also look at co-benefits. What are the other benefits that this project might receive, and how does that resonate with buyers? And I just want to highlight, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to a carbon procurement strategy. Most corporate buyers go through a set of criteria, and we end up working with buyers to shape really unique portfolios for them based on a number of considerations. So buyers need to think about what scope of their emissions are they covering. You almost always cover all of your scope 1, but how much of your scope 3 footprint are you covering? Buyers also need to think through what is the timeline of their climate commitments and how will carbon credits help them achieve those goals, and when do they need to start achieving those targets? Primarily, cost is a big factor in purchasing decisions, as well as where the project is located, what sort of co-benefits exist from that project. Is there a connection to the organization's supply chain or value chain, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And buyers need to think through what sort of claims they want to make, internal or external claims and marketing materials, and that's often a big consideration in their purchases. And just on this last slide, I want to highlight there's different ways that buyers can interact with projects. This slide lays out options that go from, say, maybe the least risky to the most risky for buyers. And starting with a spot purchase, a buyer comes to market each year. They know the volume of credits they need. They're typically subject to what the market price is at that time, which fluctuates year over year. They're also limited to what sort of projects are available in the market at that time. But it's, most of our buyers are still come to market once a year and make a spot purchase. But we're also seeing this trend where buyers are interested in supporting projects on a longer term basis, being able to commit to specific projects over time and having some certainty of where their credits are coming from year over year, which I think aligns really well with what a lot of projects are looking for, which is some guaranteed revenue and offtake and knowing that their credits have a home for some amount of time. And so there's some risks that need to be managed in these more, say, slightly more sophisticated procurement structures. Credits from projects can vary year over year. And so who bears that volumetric risk? Is that the buyer? Is that the project? That needs to be worked out contractually. But there's a lot of benefits in buyers committing to projects and working with them long term. And so we're seeing more of those trends happen in the market right now. And that's my overview. I'm not sure where we are at on time, but if there's questions, we can take them now or wait till the Q&A.
Let's hold questions for now, Steph, and keep moving on. But we will have plenty of time later. I already wrote down a few notes from your presentation I wanted to circle back on. So thank you very much. That was great, Steph. All right, Matt Marcotte's up next from Luneco Land Trust.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, Spencer, you want to give me a thumbs up so I know that you can see it?
It's not in presenter mode yet, but we see it.
Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. How about now?
Yeah, good now.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, everyone. Hello, my name is Matt Marcotte. I'm the Executive Director at Luneco Land Trust. I'm calling in from southwestern Maine today, where it seems like winter has finally arrived here in Maine. Still no snow on the ground, but we're looking forward to the changing of the seasons here, and I hope you guys are doing the same from wherever you're calling in from today. I want to thank Conservation Finance Network and Highstead for putting on this learning lab. I've always found tremendous value in my practice as a land conservation professional from these programs. And I believe, and I don't think I'm making this up, I believe the first time I was exposed to carbon markets was through a CFN program, I don't know, probably 5 years ago or something like that, when I knew nothing about the carbon markets. And I know maybe just a little bit more now than I did then. So in this presentation, I'm gonna talk about our experience as a small regional land trust engaging with carbon markets. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the dynamic of being a really small NGO and engaging on the sort of world stage of carbon markets. I'm going to talk about partnerships. I'm going to talk about the relationships with boards and committees, timing strategy. I'll go through a really sort of brief pros and cons list. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we are and plan to communicate about our work to our various audiences. So I just want to set the stage. Here we are in southwestern Maine. This is a rural part of the state. We are sort of outside of the Portland metropolitan area. Our land trust has been in operation since 1987, right around the same time. It seems a lot of land trusts were formed, maybe the golden age of land trust formation. We currently own 6,500 acres of land. Maine is the most forested state in the country. This photo here on the right is taken from one of our conservation properties, and this is sort of a good indication of the landscape that we're working in. Rolling hills, lakes, and obviously heavily forested, with most of them being the white pine trees that you see here in this photo. Timber management and silviculture has been long been a component of our land management and land protection strategies. So LUNECO has used income from timber management, timber harvesting to supplement and facilitate various land stewardship activities, and also to as a conservation finance tool for acquiring and protecting additional properties. And that's been going on since the late 90s was the first time LUNECO conducted a timber harvest. Regionally, the forest products industry has been a backbone of the economy here, along with tourism, which is growing. And then just a little bit more about LUNECO, just to give you some context. We are an organization of approximately 3.5 full-time equivalent staff and about a $400,000 operating budget. I'm going to talk obviously a lot more about our particular experience with carbon markets, but just to level set here, we made the decision to engage in the voluntary carbon market and to aggregate with another landowner, another land trust landowner. So as it stands right now, we are in the final phase of verification for a carbon offset project in the voluntary market. We expect our first issuance of credits, our first vintage of credits, to be in early 2023. So, this was a really unfamiliar environment for us. Obviously, I was starting to hear about these carbon markets. Maine has had some experience in really leading the way in terms of conservation and carbon. The first carbon project in Maine, I believe, on conservation lands was back in 2009 by the Down East Lakes Land Trust, and that was in the compliance market in the state of California's program. So again, really unfamiliar. The things that we were familiar with: timber sales. This is a photo from a timber sale that we conducted just last week. This is the last remaining pine and oak logs from a timber sale. Program revenue, sort of typical nonprofit program revenue, and of course, land transactions are bread and butter here as a land trust. These are the things that we're used to. When it comes to negotiating a business transaction, this was really sort of new territory for us. And we had to learn pretty quickly, how do you negotiate a business deal? Right off the bat, I reached out to our favorite land conservation attorney who we've worked with for 20 years. And he said, Matt, I'm not going to be much help for you in this on this one. So, we had to engage outside of our typical realm or sphere of activity. And we had to do a lot of contractual due diligence. And this was really, reaching out to folks across the industry, really to understand, what we were getting ourselves into. And we wanted to make sure that we were getting the best deal we possibly could. We didn't want to assume that that would automatically happen. So, we've talked a little bit about, and I believe Spencer mentioned this idea of, sort of accessing these markets, and we're really entering this phase where landowners of all different sizes are, at least more so than ever before, thinking about accessing these markets, and in some cases even do have access to these markets. We found out pretty quickly that by ourselves, we were not going to be able to sort of reach that threshold, that economy of scale, to make a project in the voluntary marketplace feasible. So we thought about, okay, can we aggregate? And we reached out to a local land trust who we have a really great relationship with. And we made the decision pretty early on to work together to aggregate our conservation land holdings to reach that sort of threshold. Another major sort of milestone here was we also determined at a very early stage that we were not going to be able to navigate this market alone, the intricacies of inventories and verifications and so on and so forth. So we knew we were going to need to find a partner, an industry partner who could bring expertise and understanding and help move us through this process. And so we ended up working with, and we are still working with Finite Carbon, who's been a really great partner, leading us through this process every step of the way, and helping us gain access to these markets. And we're very thankful for that relationship. We've continued to rely on existing relationships throughout our sort of professional and personal spheres to help us understand this market and make the best decisions. And choosing a partner for aggregating land, we felt that geography was really important for a variety of reasons. And as you see here in this map, this is an area that's about 1 million square acres or 1 million acres. And we had opportunities to engage with land trust partners in other part of the state or even in other states. We felt it was really important to have a similar geography. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, obviously, those relationships that exist there, personal and professional, and also thinking about the various forest types, management histories, and management regimes. We felt that this land trust was a really good partner for those reasons. So to this point, most of these conversations at our land trust had been happening at the committee level within our finance committee. And ultimately, that's where about 95% of the work was done. We felt it was really important to delegate most of the work to a committee. I think most boards probably think like that, and our board was very much aligned. We didn't want to bring all of our board members into the weeds on this. We had 2 or 3 board members who were really excited to get in, do the learning, dig deeper, and also bringing some of their professional experience to bear. And so we kept it really simple when reporting to the rest of the board. We talked about the impact, the expected revenue. We talked about how this would change our actions, our land management strategies, et cetera, et cetera. And we always brought it back to the bottom line with our board members. How is this going to help us achieve our mission? What's the long-term financial impact, really speaking to their fiduciary responsibility as board members? I wish I could tell you that we had this grand scheme for timing and strategy. A lot of it just happened to fall into place at the right time. But we did have to think about a number of circumstances, and also, frankly, staff capacity was a big factor here. I ended up investing a significant amount of my time into developing our carbon project, which of course, meant that I could not focus on other things. And with a staff of 3.5 people, a small land trust, I'm sure those of you who are working for small or even medium-sized land trusts can relate that, that's a big consideration. We also wanted to think about market considerations. Steph mentioned some of the pricing. We didn't really want to time the market, but we wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be an advantage to waiting, for instance, another 2 or 3 years to engage in the market. We also wanted to think about, of course, how this was going to impact our planned timber harvest and our forest management regimes. we wanted to think about how this could be incorporated into existing capital campaigns and for land acquisitions and the timing there, and just more broadly thinking about our land stewardship and impacts to our land stewardship program. So just to really quickly sort of pros and cons here, and this is sort of how I think about it, but ultimately sort of our organizational position as well. We're really excited about participating in nature-based climate solutions. Our board felt very strongly that this was an opportunity for our land trust to lead. We also saw this as an opportunity to establish a new revenue stream for land protection and stewardship. And as I mentioned earlier, historically, timber harvesting had really been a major component of that, and we were excited to decrease our reliance on timber harvesting and to supplement our land protection and stewardship programs with new income through the sale of carbon credits. Some of the cons, and these were conversations that happened at the board level and at the staff level, there of course was a concern about the relationship with corporates and corporate polluters who were buying these offset credits. There was some concern about the optics of striking it rich with our donor base. And we also considered the impacts on local forestry business and contractors. We've had long, really great, fruitful relationships with everyone from local forest contractors, local consulting foresters, trucking companies, et cetera. And we wanted to consider, would this impact our relationship? How would this impact their businesses? And in reality, it may. We do expect and anticipate that our timber harvesting strategies are going to change. And lastly, and this is really sort of an ongoing piece here, communications and PR. Of course, there's a lot of information out there about carbon credits. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. We've taken the strategy of highlighting how this is changing our land management strategies and our behaviors, and how that's going to impact our audiences, our donors, the communities that we serve. We really want to bring it back to those values. So every year, for instance, our land trust does a survey of our membership base, and what we're hearing for at least the last 3 years, climate change is now in the top 3 of concerns from our audiences, as is protecting wildlife habitat and access for recreation. So we wanted to bring this back again to that mission impact. What were we going to be able to do as a result of participating in these markets that we couldn't before? So again, protecting more land, providing better access, and engaging in a nature-based climate mitigation and adaptation strategy. Again, communications and PR, this is an ongoing thing. We expect that our strategies will likely change over time. And I'd be really interested in the question and answer session to hear any thoughts that some of the audience may have on this topic as well. I'm not sure where we are on time, but this is the last slide that I have, and I will hand it back over to you, Spencer.
Matt, thanks so much. That was really great. Wonderful to have sort of firsthand experience on the ground from a land trust. So thank you, Matt. All right, Jill, are you ready to come on screen? Wonderful. There you are. Take it away.
Okay there. Okay, great. I'm going to try to share screen, making sure I do it right. Let me go to the top. Let's see, I'm going to go into presenter mode first. 1 second. Just to make sure it works.
All right, we see your screen now, but not presenter mode yet.
Okay, pressing presenter mode. There it goes. I think it's just got a lag. Can you see the correct screen?
We're seeing presenter mode, so we see your next slide and notes also.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let me stop sharing real quick and share a different screen. Okay, this should be correct. Let me know if that looks right.
All right. Yep, looks great. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Greetings from Rockville, Maryland. I'm based in the DC area. As mentioned, I work for the American Forest Foundation as their Director of Climate Finance. And I'm, I suppose, coming at this, from a medium-sized NGO perspective. The previous speaker was coming from a smaller context. We are, in fact, a national NGO and traditionally working with family forest landowners. So I'm going to focus on our work in the voluntary market space, in partnership with these particular landowners. Can I go to the next slide if it wants to transition? Okay, there it goes. So just to start up, I really enjoyed this quote. I didn't get to go to Egypt actually, but Spencer, I hope you caught a lot of sun there. This was a quote actually from Jean-Paul Serveus, the IOSCO chairman at COP27 recently. And I just really thought it was quite poignant in the sense that no market can function without appropriate levels of integrity, transparency, and liquidity. So that's really all just to say, no matter how innovative and creative we get at our individual kind of organizational levels, this is not going to work unless there's a transparent, high integrity and liquid market out there. Again, we're coming at it from the voluntary market perspective, but over time, and obviously ideally, you'll see some sort of convergence in terms of compliance markets, which Steph laid out really nicely, and the voluntary markets, which have, I suppose, been kind of experimental grounds and you know, areas for incubation and innovation for a very long time. All right, let's go to the next slide here. So this slide, I'm going to zoom out in the next one so you can kind of see the bigger picture, but the focus of this is really just to say, you know, what really is the potential of natural climate solutions. So whether it's forestry, whether it's wetlands, other land management solutions, how big a piece of this kind of larger global climate mitigation challenge does NCS play? And it's actually huge, potentially. It's around a third. So it's really just to say we can't discount natural climate solutions as a critical piece of the global fight against climate change. And in particular, the two leading and highest potential areas are actually reforestation. Here you can see the bar going across the top, and natural forest management. The work that AFF has done through the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is our flagship program we developed in partnership with TNC, the Nature Conservancy, it focuses on that second bar, but we're actually branching out into reforestation, so afforestation, reforestation, revegetation, and can talk more about that. But they're really kind of two sides of the same coin here. Just zooming out, you can see those bars in terms of the highest potential. These are the most expensive solutions, all the way up to that dark green bar. The light green represents sort of, you know, the most cost-effective solutions available now, but just gives you a little bit of relative context across other natural climate solutions. Okay, so within that broader context, what role do family forest landowners play? Well, actually, in the United States context, they play an enormous role, and in many other contexts as well. So around 40% of forested US lands are owned by families. I have 10 acres in Montana. I'm originally from Montana, if anybody's from Montana. So it's very exciting that, you know, we have finally an opportunity to some extent, democratize access to the voluntary carbon markets for these smaller ownerships. And I'll show you some numbers just backing that up in a second. But they have a huge role to play if they can essentially have the resources and the technical know-how to participate in those markets. So enter the Family Forest Carbon Program. This was developed really to target that ownership class, which to that point in time, this was a few years ago, had not really been able to participate in carbon markets or voluntary carbon markets. Have a number of lofty goals, you know, sequestering a huge amount of carbon by 2030 and actually 2050. Actually, I need to update these goals. They've gotten even loftier, but really just to say AFF is really trying to, you know, impact this at scale and partner with folks who are able to do that. So we're going to keep striving to achieve that. And just to show that context I was sharing earlier, so over on the far right, you can see traditionally in the light blue, the registered forest carbon projects have involved ownerships around like 5,000 acres or more, but 80% of lands are actually owned by of 1,000 acres or less. The largest ownership class have not been able to participate and make up about 1% of those forest carbon projects to date. Why is that? Usually high transaction costs and just the complexity of participating and getting these projects going. So we created this novel methodology that allows smaller land ownerships. I think on average in our program, it's around 150 acres. And then around the United States, on average, family forest landowners around 70 acres in terms of the size of their ownerships. So the program essentially is paying landowners upfront in the form of incentive payments. And those incentive payments help them basically adopt better quality management practices for their forests. We have a number of different varieties of practice depending on the forest type. We started out actually in the Central Appalachians through a pilot project. We've now since expanded to the Northeast, to the Midwest, going to the Southeast and the South. I would say one of the most interesting things we found so far is, money is one thing, but actually the thing that is often valued most in working with the family forest landowners is access to a professional forester, a technical assistance in getting a management plan, which to date, most of them hadn't had. I think it's around 8% traditionally would have had access to a forest management plan. So just looking into some of the things that have been discussed today around integrity and how we kind of interpreting integrity. This is really critical, and I would say it's sort of what we consider the hallmark of the methodology we developed, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's not just about the methodology, it's also about, who are you selling it to what extent we're qualifying buyers, because it doesn't really make a difference if we work with landowners to mitigate climate change, but it's going to a company that has hasn't really looked into their fundamental emissions profile and started on that pathway to kind of net zero itself. Also worth noting our methodology, our improved forest management methodology, was approved in October of this year. So that was very exciting, just as a milestone in the program's life. And this is what I was referring to in terms of what I would say is sort of one of the hallmarks of the program. We introduced what we refer to as a dynamic baseline. Talk about that in a second, but actually it's been adopted and seen as quite a hallmark or quite an approach to high integrity carbon forest carbon projects, but it can be adopted for other types. And actually there's work underway for an ARR methodology also using the dynamic baseline. So what is a dynamic baseline? What does it involve? Essentially what we're doing is matching. So say you've got a set of twins, one is enrolled, one is not enrolled. We want to make sure that the twins are these matching kind of forest ownership, forest properties that have similar types of forests, similar geographies, that sort of thing, similar history, management history, and we'll monitor them over time. And that delta between essentially the enrolled property and that and the monitoring of that enrolled property and that dynamic baseline or synthetic baseline it's been matched to, that's really what we would consider truly additional carbon. So just kind of a nod to the comments about additionality there. Just showing again that delta over time. It's worth saying we sign landowners when they work with us, they sign up to a 20-year contract length. I think one of the questions in the chat was, how long is this applicable for? Well, permanence under the VERA standard, the verified carbon standard, which we utilize, it's meant to be over a 100-year period. So we invest obviously in a buffer pool and other things in case there's reversals in that contract period, but we're also setting aside money for permanence fund, which will essentially ensure technical assistance, for the life of the property over that 100-year period, among other steps to help ensure permanence of the carbon sequestered. This is the Conservation Finance Network. So I'd be remiss not to mention that this past summer in July, we issued a first of its kind green bond. I mentioned that we pay incentive payments. There's other costs incurred in the program, including outreach, and marketing to landowners to get the word out about the program. So all of that involves upfront, upfront costs, and they're fairly sizable. So how do we kind of fill this gap? And a lot of these natural climate solutions related projects have a similar problem. You're essentially growing carbon over time. And how do you fill that financing gap? So one of the initial theories of the program was to issue things like a green bond. So we proved that concept was possible. I'm not going to walk through the details on this or the next slide, but just to say it was a $10 million bond. It was a corporate QSIP fully taxable bond. It was oversubscribed by around 230%. So it was just showing the market appetite for a high quality NCS related bond of this type. It is unique in the sense that we're essentially securitizing future carbon payments. There was a discussion around the different types of carbon payments. This was actually based on forward offtake agreements. So we don't do spot market purchases. We actually have forward offtake agreements with our buyers. So just wrapping up here, this is a structure of the program in terms of how the bond proceeds are used. Just to give you a bit of an idea about the flow of funds. So here's a subsidiary of AFF, which is the Family Forest Impact Foundation, and how essentially we're exchanging incentive payments to landowners for carbon rights. And in that way, we're actually shielding landowners from the volatility of the carbon markets. So when they sign that contract, the payments and the incentive payments to them paid over time are fixed and won't change. And obviously, we've got money coming in from bondholders. We repay coupon payments based on FFIF revenues coming in, which are derived from those forward offtake agreements I mentioned with our qualified buyers. With that, I think I might leave it. Also, just worth mentioning, we work with Kestrel verifiers to certify the green bond, and it aligns with a number of sustainable development principles. So just wrapping up here, Spencer, but yeah, thank you all for your attention and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Jill. One just, I think, really quick question is, who was the issuer officially of the bond?
Yeah, so I mentioned we have a subsidiary, so it's the Family Forest Impact Foundation. So that's a wholly owned and disregarded LLC of the American Forest Foundation. And yeah, that's the official issuer.
Thanks for clarifying. Okay, Jill, wonderful. Thanks so much for that look into Family Forest carbon program and the green bonds you're using to help finance it. All right, Steph, will you come back on? And I know we're a little bit short on time, but we'd love to hear about your work specifically at 3 Degrees. And thank you again for setting the stage for everyone.
Absolutely. Can you all see my screen?
Looks great. Yep.
Okay. So just really quickly, I know we don't have much time, but 3 Degrees' mission is to help businesses and their customers take urgent action on climate change. And we do this by offering a number of different products and services related to renewable energy and decarbonization. We've got a global presence at this point, folks across North America and Europe. I'm calling into you from gray but not rainy Portland, Oregon today. And I also like to mention that we're a very proud certified B Corporation. So our work helps to balance profit with people and the planet. And so, like I mentioned, we offer a number of different products and services across, that address all 3 scopes of customers' emissions. Carbon credits are just one of the products that we offer within scope 1 and 3 solutions. And our carbon markets team has been in the carbon market ultimately since the market's inception, focusing on originating and developing new carbon projects and helping bring those projects to market. So the process that I showed earlier of overseeing project registration and ongoing project monitoring and verification is essentially what the rest of my team is doing, really responsible for the creation of the credits. And I'm responsible for managing those credits in our portfolio and making sure we find the right buyers for those credits. Historically, our focus has not been in nature-based solutions. There's a lot of really smart folks on this call today that have a lot of experience in that and know the real technical experience that's required to work with nature-based projects, but we're seeing more and more demand from the market and from our buyers for those solutions. So that's increasingly becoming more of the work that we do. A lot of the projects we work with are also focused in North America, as I think all of the panelists can attribute today. Working with projects and project development and management is a very local business. It requires having boots on the ground to support that project-related work. And so because most of our carbon team is in North America, that is where most of our projects are located. And I just want to highlight, I think it's relevant to see the different ways in which we can consider or we have considered working with projects, all the way from, let's say, the most risky, complicated structure, which would look at project equity, actually buying land and looking at other financial returns over time, to upfront prepayments, and you provide that working capital for a project before it's developed. You get credits as a return, to a forward offtake commitment. I'm going to commit to a project to X amount of credits at some price for some amount of time. So there's a lot of different financial structures that we look at when we're working with new projects. And so I think it's just relevant for folks on the call to know what the world of options potentially look like. And then I'll just end with, something that we're thinking about, and projects that we're considering are really focused on scope 3 reductions and what we're calling value chain interventions. So working with projects that have a relevance to a buyer's supply chain or value chain, and helping buyers to figure out what are those emission reduction solutions that are related to their scope 3 footprint, and how can we help them implement reduction solutions and then account for that in a new version of their greenhouse gas footprint. So in some cases, it looks like what we're calling insetting. You're creating a carbon credit, but you're applying that reduction to your scope 3 footprint, to a value chain intervention. There is an intervention that occurs and emissions are reduced, but there's a change in an emissions factor that's applied to the scope 3 footprint. So we have a couple of examples here in cases where we've been piloting this sort of work, and we think that this will become more and more relevant for corporate buyers moving forward, as there's more pressure on internal emission reductions. And so using the carbon credit framework as a way to account for the emission reductions at these projects. I know I just flew through that really quickly, but for the sake of time, I'll end there, but happy to field questions here or offline about that.
Steph, thanks so much for that. And you introduced some really interesting concepts I know we're going to get to in the Q&A. So we'll bring you back on for some of that in a minute. Tech crew behind the scenes, can we get all the panelists on the, there we go. You're already on it. Wonderful. All right. So we have a bunch of good questions in the chat. I'm going to ask some other questions too on things that came up. Steph, Jill, and Matt, thank you so much. That was really great to see and hear all of your different perspectives. You really do all come from different and complementary perspectives. So it's really, really helpful to have you all there. The pointiest question we got, I'm going to start with that one because this will be fun to see how everyone reacts to this. How much should the landowners expect to get? And the specific example was, what is the estimated incentive payment for a small landowner with about, say, 100 acres through FFI? I think that's the Family Forest Carbon Program. I think that was for Jill. And what is the total projected payment for the 8,500 acres in Maine? This questioner is looking for some concrete examples of what's in it for them. Who has an example to share?
I guess I'm the only one who has an example to share. It's a great question. Obviously, it's one of the first questions any landowner would have if a program approached them, or if somebody approached me and said, okay, what am I going to get? And actually, the reason I can't actually specifically answer that question right now in front of all you good people is because it depends on who you are. It depends on what your land management practices historically have been. And it really depends on your context. And so the reason that's important is from perspectives of, I go back to my IOSCO quote, IOSCO chairman quote, which is really around the need for integrity and transparency, and liquidity and all these things that are associated with any market, not just a voluntary or a compliance carbon market. So from that perspective, it really matters where you are, and it matters the context you're in, and it matters what happens over time. I mentioned that we do have a fixed payment. So I would describe our methodology as sort of a carbon additionality modeling. We call it CAM modeling. It's more of a bowling ball than a crystal ball. But again, based on looking at things like historical harvest behavior, and depending on the results of sort of the matching protocol, we would actually derive a payment schedule over that 20 years. It's not all up front, it's not all at the end. It's essentially, there's a phased approach in terms of how those payments are made. So I actually can't provide that answer. And I think it's a good thing I can't provide that answer, because it means that it really matters, all these different, kind of pieces of the science that go into a dynamic baseline. Now, having said that, I'm just going to add one more mix to this. It's important that we guarantee that payment, but AFF is really taking on a lot of risk in doing that, because by shielding from the carbon markets and adopting, a very rigorous methodology, that dynamic baseline, it could really come in our favor, or, it could really not come in our favor. And so the amount of verified carbon will actually vary over time, and we cannot tell that because we don't know what the future is going to hold. That was a complicated answer, and I don't mean to be cute and kind of getting around it, but I think that really illustrates the nature of methodology in that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Matt, do you care to respond to that at all?
Sure. I think, well, one, I think I'm not going to be able to answer the question point blank. We do have, contractual agreements, et cetera, et cetera. However, I think Steph did share some basic information about the pricing or current pricing of improved forest management credits. So, you can do the math, take our 8,500 acres and do the math. However, what I will say is that, we looked at the difference between our anticipated revenue from selling carbon offsets versus our anticipated revenue from maintaining our timber harvesting management regime as we have. We wanted to know, for instance, could we essentially secure the same amount of revenue by continuing to harvest trees the same way that we have done? And the answer was no. Pretty quickly, it was clear that we would realize more revenue, more income by participating in these carbon markets and changing our behaviors as it relates to timber management. So I'm not going to tell you the exact amount of revenue that we anticipate. There's also the reality that we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. There's some volatility in the market. We have a pretty good sense of, at least in the next 5 years, of what our revenue will look like. But beyond that, I think that's less clear. And we hope that the markets will continue to mature, and that the credits that we produce in our project will be offered at a premium on the market, but we're not exactly sure. We don't know those answers yet.
Thanks, Matt. Steph, if you have any price ranges to offer, jump right in. If not, we'll move on.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier in the session that we're seeing buyers pay anywhere from the low teens to the mid to high 20s, depending on the specific attributes of the project. I think we're starting to see a differentiation between avoided emissions credits and removals credits in the market, and there's maybe a slightly more willingness to pay by buyers for removals credits, although who knows if that trend will stick in the near term. It's definitely a hot topic right now in the market. And also just to remind folks that the goal here is conservation and making sure that we get financing into the hands of projects, but we're also still subject to market dynamics and supply and demand fundamentals and buyers' willingness to pay compared to how much supply exists. And so I think we're all working towards the same goal, but we have to remember that this is still a market, let's say an imperfect market, but still a market at the end of the day that we can't predict the outcome, I think, as much as we all wish we could, and provide that sort of certainty.
Yep. Yeah, I think one of the questions I know landowners often want to know, and I think a couple of people here in the chat are getting at, is the translation between the per ton carbon price that Ecosystem Marketplace publishes and great, how many tons per acre do I have, for example, and they want to compare it. And then as everyone here has pointed out, it's really a custom answer that you need to go through the process. So I know that's not very satisfying, but that is the answer for all the good reasons that Jill pointed out. Okay, I forgot to mention this at the top. A different hat I wear is I'm the president of an all-volunteer local land trust. We own about 3,000 acres, and people often ask us, or a few people ask us in the community, like, can you get involved in the carbon markets? And having Matt here as a representative of the land trust community, a question that comes up is, can all land trusts participate in carbon markets, or do you have to be otherwise actively managing for timber? And that gets a little bit the additionality question. So I'm wondering if maybe one or maybe two of you want to talk a bit about what the right kind of landowner is for doing a carbon project from a land trust perspective.
I'm happy to start. We talked a little bit about additionality here, and the right landowner for a carbon project, from my perspective, is a landowner similar to our land trust, someone who has a long history of managing the timber product on their properties, and ultimately the behavior change is what generates the commodity. And so when we look at landowners, the range of landowners, land trusts, for instance, who do not typically or have not historically harvested wood on their properties, I don't think that would be a good fit for an IFM carbon offset program. Maybe some of my colleagues here would have a different perspective to offer there, but it's important to understand this concept of additionality and behavior change as a result of participating in these markets. So in Maine, most of our land trusts in Maine here, I showed you that photo of the thick forested carpet of trees. We're the most forested state in the country. Many land trusts in Maine have long practiced timber harvesting as a standard component of their land stewardship programs, which I think makes land trusts operating in rural communities or rural parts of the country where timber harvesting has long been an important component. Those are the right fits. And I'll let Steph or Jillian add anything else they've got.
I can add from my experience and perspective that we've often seen projects that are really just pure conservation projects, maybe slightly more criticizable. And this isn't my personal opinion, just from what I've seen in my experience in the market. That doesn't mean that those projects are not additional. We've just seen the arguments that, this project had never harvested, and so why is it getting carbon revenue for not harvesting in the future? And I think we have some really robust arguments against why that's not the right stance to be taking. Just because a former landowner hasn't harvested doesn't mean that future landowners won't. And so by implementing a carbon project, you make some guarantees that the land will be maintained. And so I think that there is an additionality argument to be made, but just from a reputational perspective, we have seen criticisms of those projects, maybe more so than projects that are working for us.
Thanks, Steph. We're getting a lot of really practical questions now. We're not gonna be able to take them all, but let me take one that's really important, I think, in particular. If we're not able to give an answer to how much might a land trust get, how is a land trust to know, or any landowner for that matter, to know if they should? So could somebody describe briefly the process by which a landowner, whether it's a land trust or not, would actually understand and come to know what they might get from it? Could someone, maybe not everyone, but one or two of you, just sort of give the overview of how that generally works?
I feel for all of my land trust colleagues out there that have very little time in their day, wear many different hats. And of course, right now, here we are in the month of December, all trying to, finish strong in our fundraising goals. And so I would say that this is where partnerships are really important, Spencer, and, reaching out to industry professionals, to organizations, entities that are deeply engaged in this work to help you get the answers to your questions. Because we determined really fairly early on in the process that this was not going to be something that we could go it alone. And we were going to need to explore various options, various opportunities. and reach out across our professional networks to understand what we were looking at. And it took a long time for us to really be able to say, yes, this is going to make sense both financially and also from the perspective of our conservation goals. It was not a short process, and that's something that I want to make sure that folks are hearing today, that this is a years-long process, at least how we developed our project. And we, I think, really began in earnest back in the early part of 2020. And here it is, almost 2023. Again, we're expecting our first credit sales in the first quarter of 2023. So it's a 3-year process. It takes time.
Okay. Question about time, but a little bit different element of it. Jill, you mentioned, I just want to make sure everyone understands the time duration of a project. You mentioned 20 years, you mentioned 40 years, and you mentioned 100 years, I think, at different points. Could you just talk a bit about the different, the crediting period versus the commitment of the landowner versus the 100-year climate benefit? Just help everyone understand those different durations. Which part is the landowner responsible for? Which part is the project developer, Family Forest Carbon in this case, responsible for? Could you just explain a bit more about the timeline of these projects? And then if Matt or Steph are working under different timelines, it'd be helpful if you clarified that too.
Yeah, happy to. And because I was running out of whiz through it and get the last speaker, I probably did not do justice to the details, but Spencer, you're pro in this area too and have a deep knowledge of this. So if I'm missing anything, please do correct me. I do sit on the finance side, just to be clear. I'm not on the science side and working closely with Vera in that context. We have an entire team dedicated to that. But generally speaking, it's important to highlight that in the FFCP context, one of the ways that we were able to actually lower transaction costs is taking a grouped project approach. In other words, Matt, he's not going to enroll in the program and kind of be tracked individually on this level and go to Vera and we pay all the fees and register the project and sell the carbon, et cetera. It's in a grouped approach. So it would be this whole Zoom call, right, or something of that nature. Also worth mentioning, we have to use a randomized sampling approach. So not every individual property has equipment on the ground and has a trained person coming every year and monitoring their carbon and comparing it to that unenrolled property. So I left out some key details there, but generally speaking, it's a grouped approach. We take a randomized sampling. Those two things lower transaction costs. The contract lengths are 20 years, but because we're enrolling over, say, a 12-year period, what you could think of as like cohorts or graduating classes, over time, I think it's 30 or 40 years. You guys correct me if I'm wrong, where you have to have, okay, Steph is nodding. What I'm trying to get at here, what's it officially referred to, just so I don't get the term wrong in terms of the duration of the project? Isn't it 30 years or is it 40 years?
40 years.
40 years. Okay. I'm tired. It's almost Christmas. All right. So that you've got a cohort approach, you've kind of got everyone enrolled, carrying out these practices, again, based on kind of changing behaviors, additionality for 40 years. But after that point in time, they're no longer technically contracted. So that's why you want the behavior change. You want to make sure that they're maintaining the benefits and the practices across all the conservation kind of contexts up to a 100-year period, particularly for the carbon, right? But for all the other things that we care about too, wildlife, air, water, et cetera, soil. I hope that helps a bit. So in order to kind of essentially help with that permanence, that's what I was discussing in terms of a permanence fund. So you essentially setting aside some of your carbon revenues to some extent for perpetuity to help finance, say, those technical assistance activities. So if you have a change in ownership or say, a family member, inherits the property, that sort of thing, you want continuity in that management practice. I hope that
was great, Jillian. Thank you. Matt, is there a quick answer for you? How long as a landowner is your commitment to participate in the program under the methodology you're using?
Yeah, so it's a 40-year commitment. The most of the payment is front loaded, and that's I won't get into all the details of how that works, but it's essentially related to the existing carbon that's stored in the trees on our properties. And Jillian makes a great point about the sort of carrying costs of a 40-year commitment. So, we did a series of modeling exercises to really determine what we thought those costs would look like over a period of 40 years. And right off the bat, when we do sell our first round of credits, we're going to be restricting those funds into an endowment to pay for those long-term costs. And, we hope that those costs will continue to go down, but we sort of modeled for a worst case scenario. What we don't want is for this to become a burden on our successors at the land trust. And so we felt very strongly about setting this up for success right from the get-go. But I think it's important, and I'm glad, Jillian brought that up, that this is not a, sign on the dotted line, get your money and, see you in 40 years. There are rigorous standards to continuing to verify the project over its lifespan. And we wanted to make sure that we could do that and not put a burden on the land trust for the long term.
Thanks. Yeah. So, and Steph, I think 3 Degrees works across maybe a whole group of different methodologies. Is that right? Do you want to say anything more about the different length kinds of contracts that you work with?
Yep. Depending on the methodology you're using and the standards body that you're registering a project with, timeframes will vary. It can be anywhere from a 20 to a 100-year contractual commitment for a project for a landowner, depending on which standard the project is registered under. So that varies. There are some ways to manage around those temporal obligations, but for that we've implemented with some of the landowners we work with. But for the sake of time today, we can maybe pick that up in another discussion offline.
Great. So in Steph's presentation at the beginning, she did a great job of giving the overview of there are different standards bodies, and then there are different methodologies under the standards bodies. So depending upon which program is a best fit for you, you might enroll in a contract length of different periods. And some of those have ongoing incentive payments. Some of them are bulk upfront payments with additional future payment opportunities. Some of them have longer monitoring periods than others. And so it really depends upon the program. And that's why I think really finding the partners like the way Matt talked about and understanding which program is the best fit for your sort of style of management in your finances, I think is really important. The key thing that's really exciting is that if we were having this conversation 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you would have maybe a couple of options. And now landowners have lots of options that you can sort of customize for your style of management. I think that's a really important message to get home, is that there are a lot more options for all sizes of landowners now than there used to be. All right, so we have a question. It's really good. I think it's directed at Matt in particular, but anyone can comment on it. It was about improved forest management projects. How would you describe the anticipated changes to management that you actually had to do to store more carbon? And I'm curious, Matt, for your take on that. And then Jill, since your program offers different types of silvicultural interventions, I think that's one really novel element of your program. It'd be great to hear from both of you a little bit about what kinds of management changes, Matt, are you actually having to make? And Jillian, what kinds of management opportunities, I guess, do you offer?
Sure, I'll try to be short-winded here. So this area of Maine and sort of the legacy, the land management legacy here, again, is timber harvest and heavy timber harvest going back 100, 150 years. We're recovering from a particularly devastating ice storm that occurred about 20 years ago. Many of the forests that we own are in various stages of early to mid succession. And so, we've used, again, timber harvest income as a source for conservation finance and land management capital. We anticipate that we know that our behavior is going to change in terms of timber harvesting. We're going to be receiving less revenue as a result of that behavior change. But one opportunity that we're really excited about is to be able to actually implement some timber harvesting strategies that are less, where the goal is less focused on the income and more focused on habitat and creating better habitat, whether that's growing trees that can store more carbon, or even thinking about species adaptation, looking at the various habitat needs, underrepresented habitats, et cetera, across our land base. So we're excited about both the opportunity to deploy carbon financing into our land protection work, but also to deploy it sort of in the other direction back towards our land management strategies, specifically our timber management strategies, to make it more economically feasible for us to go in and make an entrance into a forest, to conduct a prescription that really is about enhancing, whether again, carbon stocks, habitat values, et cetera. So that's an exciting opportunity that we think is going to be feasible for us where it really hadn't been before.
All right, we have to cut it there. I got a little ahead of myself in asking an additional question. We're going to lose people quickly. So I want to say thank you really quickly to Steph, Jill, and Matt for all your expertise in sharing it today and highlighting a bit of your program. I'm going to say goodbye and turn it back over to Lee. And thank you to the CFN and Highstead teams.
We could keep this going for quite a long time if you didn't get the gist of just how barely scratching the surface we are in carbon. But I hope folks understand that the speakers that we recruited, some of the examples that we brought together, are really to come at this from different angles relative to the types of projects that we anticipate each of you might be talking to your board about, exploring as an organization, et cetera. We're going to continue this learning journey, the Learning Lab, with our next series on January 10th. The subject will be public funding. And essentially, if you haven't paid attention to the headlines, there are many billions of new dollars that have recently become available through a number of federal programs and legislation. So those allocations are, rumored to be out there. How do you find out about them? How do you anticipate them? What are they? And can we learn a little bit of the secret sauce, especially of how some of the larger conservation NGOs, the TNCs, TPLs, TCFs of the world, really think about helping to secure those funds by working closely with their federal partners. So it'll be hopefully a mix of educational and practical to help you better anticipate RFPs and better understand what might be out there to support your work. So we hope to see you on January 10th. In the meantime, I really want to thank Matt, Spencer, Steph, and Jill for joining us today, to the Highstead team working very diligently behind the scenes to make sure today ran smoothly, and to wish everyone who joined us a very happy holidays. We look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thanks, folks. Take care.